In spiritual science, old age is not regarded as a mere continuation of earlier life under diminished forces, nor as a passive decline toward the end of earthly existence. It is understood as a qualitatively new phase of human development, one in which the direction of consciousness subtly changes. Whereas in youth and midlife, the human being is primarily oriented toward the future, toward becoming, striving, achievement, and outward realization. In later life, the soul is increasingly called to turn inward and backward, not in a mood of regret or nostalgia, but in a gesture of spiritual comprehension. This backward-looking movement is not accidental. It corresponds to an objective spiritual necessity. Retrospection of life becomes, in old age, a task through which the human being prepares both for death and for the life beyond death. In earlier periods of life, memory serves practical purposes. We remember in order to act, to plan, to correct mistakes, to navigate the outer world. But in old age, memory gradually loosens itself from immediate utility. Events long past arise with a peculiar vividness, often accompanied by emotions that were not consciously experienced at the time. Spiritual science shows that this is not simply a psychological phenomenon caused by weakening bodily forces. Rather, it is the sign that the etheric body is beginning to detach itself, little by little, from its tight connection to the physical organism. As this loosening occurs, the life tableau that is normally concealed behind the stream of everyday consciousness begins to shimmer through. This process anticipates, in a gentle and fragmentary way, what occurs after death, when the etheric body separates entirely and the human being experiences a comprehensive life review. In old age, however, this review is not imposed from outside. It can be consciously taken up as a task. The human being can learn to look back on life not merely as a sequence of personal successes and failures, but as a meaningful whole shaped by destiny, encounters, and inner transformations. Such retrospection is not judgment in the moralistic sense. It is an act of understanding, an effort to perceive how the I has worked through circumstances and how circumstances have worked upon the I. What is essential here is the manner of looking back. If the soul becomes entangled in reproach, bitterness, or self-justification, the retrospective forces harden and lose their spiritual fruitfulness. But if the human being practices a quiet, objective contemplation, almost as though observing the life of another person, then a new quality of consciousness can arise. One begins to recognize patterns that were invisible while living forward in time. Relationships reveal their karmic depth. Apparent failures show themselves as necessary turning points. Sufferings disclose a hidden formative power. This kind of retrospection strengthens the I, not by inflating it, but by freeing it from unconscious identification with past events. In this sense, old age offers a unique possibility to transform memory into wisdom. Wisdom, in the spiritual scientific understanding, is not the accumulation of knowledge, but the capacity to behold life in its lawful connections. Through retrospective contemplation, the soul gradually learns to perceive its own biography as a meaningful composition, rather than a random chain of occurrences. This perception does not erase pain, but it places pain within a larger context. The soul becomes calmer, more reconciled, not because everything was good, but because everything belonged to a path. Such inner work has consequences that extend beyond the present incarnation. Spiritual science points out that the way a human being relates to their past in old age influences the experiences of the soul after death. A life that has been inwardly understood becomes lighter to carry into the spiritual world. Unresolved resentments, rigid judgments, and unexamined attachments, on the other hand, create weight that must later be worked through under more difficult conditions. Retrospection in old age thus serves as a kind of preparation, a schooling of consciousness for the supersensible existence. It is important to emphasize that this task is not dependent on outer circumstances. Whether a life appears outwardly fulfilled or marked by limitation, the possibility of spiritual retrospection remains. Even a life that seems narrow or constrained can be inwardly rich if it is truly comprehended. Conversely, a life full of outer activity can remain spiritually poor if it is never inwardly surveyed. Old age therefore confronts the human being with a quiet but decisive question. Can I behold my life without illusion, without accusation, and without fear? In this first phase of the task of retrospection, the essential step is learning to let the past speak, not to interrogate it aggressively, but to listen. As bodily forces recede, the soul is invited to cultivate patience and attentiveness. Memories that surface unbidden often carry precisely the content that seeks integration. When met with openness, they can become seeds of insight rather than sources of disturbance. Thus, the backward gaze of old age is not a turning away from life, but a deepening into its meaning, a movement through which the human being begins to stand more firmly within their own spiritual biography. As the work of retrospection deepens, the human being gradually discovers that looking back upon life is not merely an activity of memory, but an exercise of a new kind of perception. In youth and middle age, consciousness is bound tightly to the physical organism. Thinking depends on the brain, feeling on the nervous system, willing on the metabolic and limb processes. In old age, however, this bond slowly loosens. The soul begins to experience itself less as something enclosed within the body and more as something that uses the body as an instrument. This change is subtle, but it is decisive for the spiritual task of later life. Through this loosening, the I gains the possibility of a more objective relationship to its own past. Experiences that once seemed inseparable from the self can now be viewed at a certain distance. One no longer says unconsciously, I am this event, or I am this failure, but begins to say, often without words, this happened to me, or even, this was allowed to happen so that something could be learned. This shift marks a profound inner emancipation. The I steps out of the stream of time and begins to survey it. Spiritual science describes this capacity as an anticipation of post-mortem consciousness. After death, the human being beholds their life in reverse order, in a great etheric tableau, experiencing the effects of their deeds on others rather than their own intentions. In old age, a similar but gentler process can be cultivated consciously. One can practice seeing one's actions not only from the standpoint of personal motivation, but from the standpoint of how they were received by the world. This is not meant to produce guilt or pride, but understanding. Understanding is the healing force here. Such understanding transforms the soul's relationship to time. Regret loses its sharpness because it is replaced by insight. Pride loses its rigidity because it is relativized by a broader view. Even grief can change its character. Loss is no longer experienced solely as deprivation, but as a formative force that shaped inner capacities. Through this transformation, the soul becomes more inwardly mobile, more capable of bearing complexity without inner fragmentation. This inner mobility is especially important because old age often brings a reduction of outer activity. Roles fall away, professional identity, social position, even certain family functions. What once gave structure to life may no longer be present. Without an inner task, this loss can lead to emptiness or bitterness. Retrospection, however, provides a new center of gravity. It gives the soul something to do that is not dependent on physical strength or social recognition. It makes inner life productive. In this context, Steiner often emphasized that old age is not a time for clinging to what was, but for transforming what was into something new. The raw material of life, experiences, encounters, joys, sufferings, can be transmuted into insight. This transmutation is a real spiritual process. Just as the body metabolizes physical substances, the soul metabolizes life experiences. In youth, this metabolism happens unconsciously. In old age, it can become conscious. The quality of this conscious work depends largely on the moral atmosphere in which it is carried out. Retrospection is fruitful only when it is permeated by sincerity. Self-deception is the greatest obstacle. To gloss over uncomfortable truths, to rewrite one's biography in order to protect self-image, hardens the soul and prevents real insight. Yet sincerity must be balanced with compassion toward oneself. Harsh self-condemnation is just as unfruitful as denial. The right mood is one of calm truthfulness, combined with understanding that the human being always acts within limits. Here, the role of spiritual beings again becomes relevant. The angel of the human being, who accompanies the biography from birth to death, stands especially close during this phase of life. While in earlier years the angel works more in guiding future possibilities, in old age this being helps illuminate the past, not by whispering explanations, but by strengthening the soul's capacity for truthfulness and reconciliation. When a person feels inwardly supported while looking back on difficult life chapters, this support often has a real spiritual origin. The work of retrospection also changes the relationship to death. Death is no longer experienced only as a threatening unknown, but as a transition toward a state for which one is already preparing inwardly. The more a person has learned to survey their life in freedom, the less overwhelming the life review after death will be. Old age thus offers the possibility of a gentle schooling for death, not through morbid preoccupation, but through a natural completion of life's meaning. This does not mean that fear disappears entirely. Fear belongs to the human condition, but it can be transformed. Fear that is met with understanding loses its paralyzing power and becomes attentiveness. The soul learns to stand before the mystery of existence without demanding certainty, but also without collapsing into despair. This stance is itself a spiritual achievement. In this second phase of the task of retrospection, the human being learns to behold their life as a whole, without identifying with any single part of it. The eye becomes freer, quieter, more spacious. It begins to live less in reaction and more in comprehension. This prepares the ground for a further deepening in which retrospection becomes not only understanding of the past, but a source of active spiritual forces for the future beyond earthly life. As retrospection matures further, It gradually ceases to be concerned primarily with individual events and begins to orient itself toward the underlying direction of the whole life. The human being no longer asks only what happened, but what was being sought through what happened. This shift marks a decisive deepening of consciousness. The biography is no longer experienced merely as a sequence of outer circumstances, but as the expression of an inner intention that has worked, often invisibly, through changing forms. At this stage, the soul begins to perceive that many of the most decisive impulses of life did not arise from conscious planning. Encounters that later proved formative, decisions that altered the life path, even illnesses and losses often entered from the periphery of awareness. In retrospection, these moments reveal themselves as nodal points, where destiny spoke more clearly than personal will. This recognition does not diminish freedom, it refines it. The eye learns to distinguish between what it has chosen and what it has been guided toward. Such insight leads to a new relationship with the concept of destiny. Destiny is no longer experienced as something imposed from outside, nor as a chain of blind necessities. It becomes intelligible as a dialogue between the I and the spiritual world. The human being begins to sense that life has answered inner questions that were never consciously formulated. What once seemed arbitrary begins to appear as meaningful, even if its meaning is not fully transparent. This perception is closely connected with the development of gratitude. Gratitude in old age is not primarily directed toward pleasant experiences, but toward the fact that one has been led again and again into situations that made growth possible. Such gratitude does not deny suffering, it includes it. It recognizes that without certain hardships, essential inner capacities would not have been awakened. This form of gratitude is not emotional exuberance, but quiet affirmation. It gives the soul firmness without rigidity. Through this affirmation, the soul begins to experience a new kind of freedom. It is no longer bound so tightly to the need to justify its past or to defend its identity. The question, "Who am I?" gradually transforms into "What has lived through me?" This shift loosens the ego boundary in a healthy way. The I does not dissolve. It becomes more transparent to the spiritual forces that have shaped it. This transparency is one of the most characteristic qualities of spiritually fruitful old age. In this condition, memory itself undergoes a transformation. Memories are no longer stored as isolated images, but are gathered into meaningful constellations. One begins to remember not chronologically, but thematically. Certain motifs recur: the search for truth, the struggle for independence, the need for belonging, the experience of loss. These motifs reveal the deeper structure of the biography. They show what the soul has been practicing across decades, often without conscious awareness. This recognition has an ethical dimension. When a person sees the recurring motifs of their life, they also see where tendencies have remained untransformed. Certain patterns may appear again and again, unresolved. In old age, these patterns can no longer be worked through primarily by outward action. The opportunity lies instead in inner transformation. One can inwardly acknowledge these tendencies, understand their origin, and release them. Such release is a real moral act, even if it has no outer expression. From the standpoint of spiritual science, this inner moral work has objective consequences. What the human being inwardly clarifies in old age is carried into the spiritual world as a force, unclarified tendencies must be encountered later under more constraining conditions. Clarified tendencies, on the other hand, become seeds for future capacities. Thus, retrospection is not only backward-looking, it is profoundly future-oriented. It prepares the conditions for the next stage of existence. At this level, the work of retrospection often becomes quieter and less verbal. The soul no longer needs to narrate its life to itself. It rests more in moods of comprehension, in silent recognition. Words become secondary. What matters is the inner stance. The soul learns to dwell in what has been without clinging to it. This dwelling is neither resignation nor withdrawal. It is presence. Such presence has a radiating effect on others. People who have engaged deeply in this kind of inner work often become sources of calm and clarity in their surroundings, even if they say little. Their very way of being carries the imprint of reconciliation. This is not the result of personality traits, but of spiritual labor accomplished inwardly. Old age, in this sense, becomes a gift to the community, even when it is outwardly modest. The third phase of retrospection thus leads beyond personal biography toward a more universal human perspective. The individual life is seen as a variation on themes common to humanity as a whole. This recognition softens the boundaries between self and others. Compassion deepens, not as sentimentality, but as understanding, born of experience. The soul stands more firmly within the human condition, having recognized its own path as one expression among many. In the final phase of retrospection, the soul gradually turns from understanding toward surrender, not a surrender of dignity or clarity, but a surrender of the demand to hold life together by personal effort alone. The human being begins to sense that the task of old age is not to complete life in the sense of finishing something, but to hand it over. What is handed over is not only the physical organism, but the whole biography, inwardly worked through and transformed into essence. At this stage, the past is no longer actively reviewed in detail. What remains is a quiet, inner certainty that life has been lived within a meaningful order, even where that order could not be recognized at the time. This certainty does not arise from belief, but from the work of retrospection itself. It is the fruit of having looked honestly, patiently, and compassionately at one's own path. The soul no longer needs to ask continuously whether things could have been different. The question shifts from, "Why did this happen?" to, "What has been given through this?" This shift marks the transition from biography to being. The human being no longer defines themselves primarily by what they have done or suffered, but by what they have become. What they have become is not a sum of achievements, but a quality of soul, depth, resilience, clarity, or quiet strength. These qualities are not bound to memory in the ordinary sense. They are carried by the eye as enduring forces. Spiritual science describes this moment as one in which the eye begins to loosen its exclusive bond to earthly time. The future no longer appears primarily as something to be planned or controlled. Instead, the soul develops trust in the guidance that has already led it thus far. This trust is not naive optimism. It is grounded in lived experience. Having seen how meaning could emerge even from difficulty, the soul becomes capable of facing the unknown without inner collapse. Here the relationship to death changes decisively. Death is no longer experienced solely as an interruption or loss, but as a continuation in another form. The soul feels, often without clear images, that it is already learning to live without the physical body. The increasing independence from outer activity, the ability to dwell in silence, the deepening of inward life, all these are preparations. Retrospection thus becomes a bridge between earthly and supersensible existence. This does not mean that the human being withdraws from the world. On the contrary, many people in this phase develop a heightened interest in the essence of things. They listen more deeply, judge less hastily, and respond with greater measure. Their presence becomes less reactive and more receptive. Such presence is not passive. It is attentive, awake, and often deeply comforting to others. Without instruction or admonition, it communicates that life can be born and understood. In this final phase, the work of retrospection is largely completed. What remains is a mood of inner consent. Consent not to everything that happened in a superficial sense, but to the fact that one's life belonged to a larger spiritual narrative. This consent frees the soul from inner resistance. Resistance, more than suffering, is what burdens the soul after death. Where resistance has been transformed into understanding, the soul becomes lighter. The angel being of the human individual stands very near at this threshold. While in earlier life this being works primarily toward future possibilities, here its activity is oriented toward integration. It helps gather what has been lived into a coherent spiritual form. This form is not a memory image, but a moral and spiritual reality that accompanies the human being beyond death. Seen in this light, old age is not a time of diminishing value, but a time of condensation. What was spread out over decades is gathered inwardly. What was lived unconsciously is brought into awareness. What was fragmented is unified. Retrospection is the means by which this gathering occurs. It is not an optional spiritual exercise, but the natural task of this life phase, whether consciously taken up or not. To take it up consciously is to cooperate with the deeper intentions of human existence. It is to meet life not with resignation, but with understanding, not with fear, but with readiness. Through retrospection, the human being learns to stand within their own biography as within a completed form, not closed, but fulfilled. And in this fulfillment, the soul finds the quiet strength to step across the threshold of death, having transformed life into meaning and time into experience that can be carried forward into the spiritual world.